Steph, and thank you everyone. It's always a pleasure to speak about, well, I shouldn't say it's a pleasure to speak about PDF accessibility, but I guess this is what I do. I am Adam Spencer. I'm head of accessibility services for Accessibil-IT. We're the largest PDF remediation service provider in the world. This is all we do. And as Duff mentioned, I do come from Canada. And where I'm from, we have some of the toughest accessibility laws in the world. I'll share how tough they are in a second. So where do we start? And all of you who are sitting in this room have faced a dilemma. We're now told we have to make our content accessible. Now what? So just quick show of hands, who knows how to tag a PDF or thinks they know how to tag a PDF? You've taken training, yeah, that's great. No, or just winged it, that's what I did, that's how I started. But you deal as an organization with trying to figure out what to do. You're told you have to do this, there's law that tells you you have to do this, now what? For one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now is this war between PDF and HTML. Who's had an internal discussion, convert everything to HTML because we understand WCAG, right? And it's all because people aren't prepared to take the time to learn how to make a PDF accessible. I can tell you empirically, it costs 1/4 the dollar value to tag a PDF than it does to convert that content into accessible HTML. We've done work with Health Canada and done a study on it, and it's that much faster to keep your content as it is. The other thing is, I am not just a PDF person. I don't believe that everything should be PDF. Sorry, Duff. But there's a balance. Not everything should be HTML either. Not everything should be a tweet. You've got to understand that certain content is better suited for different formats and learn what to do with that format to make sure that it is accessible and compliant. I am very black and white when it comes to accessibility and compliance. It's either PDF UA compliant or it isn't. I don't believe in gray areas. That's why I only use certain checkers. It's either compliant or it's not. And the problem that you're going to face, and this is something that we've been dealing with in Ontario, is that that gray area has gotten companies into trouble. They've paid a lot of money to have things made accessible, but they aren't actually getting compliant content, and that's now coming back to bite them. So, this is a very common problem. When the federal government in Canada was sued by an individual who couldn't apply for a job, the judge ruled that every single piece of content from Confederation, so 1867 forward, had to be made accessible. Now, I can tell you that will bankrupt Canada in about 3 days. That's impossible. But you're faced with this mountain. And in response, the Canadian federal government removed 98% of their content from online archives and said no Canadians have access to it. They've then since been sued again, and that content's back. And we're finding some reality to our approach for accessibility. But in Ontario, any piece of content created after 2012 must be compliant. And that's by any organization that employs more than 50 people. So it's not just government, it's business as well. So we're faced, our clients are often, well, our clients are global, but our Canadian clients are faced with this dilemma, what do we do? And I'm sure that all of you have had that same experience. You've got giant archived collections, you can't remove it legally, but how do you build a sustainable approach? And my response to that is, there is not one approach that will work. There is not an easy button for accessibility. There is not a silver bullet that will solve all of your document accessibility problems. You've got to look at different types of content in different ways. And that's the biggest thing that I can impose upon you. You need to realize, there was a question earlier today about social insurance content being generated. There are different solutions for that. You're not going to deal with it in an ad hoc fashion. You've got to automate it, and there are ways to do that. So it's all about the base. I'm an enormous Blue Jays fan, so I apologize. And you took our other Canadian baseball team, and I didn't like them anyways. So it's understanding, and I was on the field for this, sorry. Big baseball geek moment for me. It's understanding how your content is being generated, okay? Is it being generated by an individual at a desktop? Is it being generated by a server-based process? Is it being generated in an automated ad hoc fashion? You have to understand how that content's being created in order to develop a document accessibility strategy going forward. I cannot impress that enough. You have to understand how someone is going to interact with the content, because you will never be able to hire enough monkeys on typewriters to manually remediate all of your content internally. Unless I misread the budget docs last week, you don't have unlimited money. I'm going out on a limb. You also have to understand your document landscape and understanding where your content is, how you're going to make it compliant. Not all of your content needs to stay online, but you've got to understand what does, where are you, how are you going to deal with that reality going forward. We often tell our clients that you've got to chunk it out in years and batches, and we had an opportunity in Ontario where we had 5 years to ramp up. Once the legislation went in, you had 5 years to make sure everything on your site was accessible before every single piece of content at time of authoring had to be compliant. So here are institutional realities, and these are universal. I speak all over the world, and I've yet to find something that's different from this. Budget freezes, hiring freezes, limitations of training, and core competencies. When you understand that nobody has been hired to be a document accessibility expert, nobody, even me. I started my company, I knew nothing about PDF accessibility. But you have to learn that you're not going to be able to impose this on your team. It just doesn't work. It's not successful. And I can tell you this because we saw it happen. The provincial government in Ontario provided training to 65,000 staff on how to tag a PDF. Create it from Word, PowerPoint, Excel, InDesign, generate a PDF. Today, there are 2 people, in my opinion, that know how to tag a PDF for the entire provincial government. 2. Out of paying for training for 65,000. Now, whether that's an issue with follow-through, that could be part of it, but the reality is everyone was hired to do their job, right? Nobody was hired, if you're a graphic designer, you weren't hired to be an accessibility expert. So you've got to understand what your team is. You've got to understand their capabilities and also their availability in time. How many of us sit around in our offices with nothing to do for 3 hours a day, right? Usually the opposite. We're forced to sit there for an extra 3 hours to catch up from what we missed previously. So you've got to understand where your balance is going to be. If you have the opportunity to bring in a dedicated team, fantastic. But if you don't, then you've got to understand how you're still going to meet your requirements, but within your reality in your department. So why choose PDF UA? I'm not plugging the PDF Association or the standard, even though I have a giant tattoo of the PDF UA logo on my back. This allows us to create a line in the sand. There were questions about Word earlier and that checker, Adobe's checker, other checkers. I'm not here to promote a product at all. We're not a product company. But when you understand that you've got a black and white line, when your butt is on the line, this is on you to make sure that your content's accessible. And you don't want a gray area because you get into these areas that start saying, well, I think it's accessible. I think this passed a checker. Do you know what that checker's capable of doing? Just because it's got a big name on it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best option for what you're looking for. The nice thing with PDF UA is it is black and white. You do this, you do this, you do this, you're compliant. You still have to manually check it because anyone can spoof a checker. I can do that very easily, and all of you can as well. But if you're only going to be tagging and remediating based on, and fixing based on a fail report, you're not understanding the underpinnings of document accessibility. And the one thing that I have to stress most is that this isn't about passing a checker. PDF UA is the difference between someone reading content and being included in the world or not. So that's why this is not about checking. This is not just about a test. This is the difference between someone being able to live an independent life. And to me, that's the most important part. PDF UA helps us do that. I've got 4 quick case studies because I know we're short on time. The 80-20 rule. This ministry, we do a lot of work with them, but they determined that what they could handle internally was anything under 20 pages. Anything under 20 pages, their team had the time, the skill set, and the ability to do that internally. But their hard and fast rule, if it's 21 pages, it's outsourced. And it's not just to us, it's to many vendors. But the idea is they found their balance. They knew what they could handle, and they made a strategy about getting around that hurdle because they weren't able to bring in more teams. They weren't able to actually pay the higher costs for the internal remediation. So the provincial government has set up an accessibility group that's a cost recovery team, and their internal costs are significantly higher than any of the outsourced remediators. So they determined that the best option for them was to do 20 pages or less in-house, ship everything out that wasn't under that threshold. Unfortunately, this is a GIF, and it's animated, and it's really cute. This girl's trying to jam a square block into a triangle. Usually gets lots of laughs, but we won't have that today. Right approach for the job. Deloitte, huge consulting firm, their Canadian team obviously had to comply with the AODA legislation in Canada, and they determined right off the bat they were not going to do this in-house. They had a huge graphic design team, massive group, responsible for all of their national publishing, and said, we don't do this. We can't force our designers to do it. They don't want to do it. We're going to outsource it. Again, massive company having to comply with the legislation. And the interesting thing is, and I know this is a big government group, they ended up winning a huge contract with the province because all of their content was accessible. So the other consulting firms who haven't proceeded the same way that Deloitte has have not made the same returns back. I was hired to do my work. Train everyone lavishly, you can't overspend on training, and that was from Tom Peters. I don't agree with this, and I know that's not always a popular thing amongst internal teams. However, as I mentioned beforehand, the provincial government had trained 65,000 people, and very few people are actually following through with their PDF remediation efforts. This one was fascinating, though. A very large municipal government in Ontario was told that they had to make all of their content accessible under the law, and their union was grieved, saying, I was hired as a city planner. If you think that I'm going to tag a PDF, we're going on strike. Full stop. The city no longer does anything in-house. It's a fascinating reality because you've got people who are, this room, interested in Section 508, which is great, but we're a special breed. And be proud of that. But trying to convince everyone else on your team is going to be more of a challenge. I'm not suggesting it can't be successful, but this is what we've seen actually happen in practice. And you've got to be prepared for that, because if you do have this problem and you do still need to make your content accessible, what are you going to do when a union comes back and says, not doing it? The law says you have to. Not my problem. Hire someone else. I was hired to do my job. This is my job description. And when you start looking at budgets, one of the recourses from that same union was, no problem. Pay everyone else, pay all of us an extra $20,000 a year, and we'll do this. Well, where's that money coming from, right? So you've just got to be prepared for how people are going to respond. The accessibility space is an amazing bubble, and I love being a part of it. I love working with all of the people inside. But outside, there is a big wide world that doesn't care about what we're doing, and they're doing it to tick a box to make sure that they are compliant with a legislation or a law or a requirement. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the reality. I have been both applauded and booed for that statement at accessibility conferences. Post-secondary education, and I know this doesn't apply specifically here, but the reality is some content is really, really hard. Math content, for example, scientific content, anyone who works in any of those types of departments, you're going to be dealing with very complex subject matter. And understanding how to correctly convey that to someone who cannot see it or potentially can't comprehend it the same way, it's not just as simple as throw on a tag and add some alt text. You've got to understand how a user is going to interact with that content, because the more complex the subject matter, the harder it is for them to comprehend it coming through a screen reader. And alt text can't be navigated. You can't pause it, you can't rewind it, you can't delay. So everyone says simplify your text descriptions. Well, how do you simplify that? Not that specifically, obviously, but something along those lines. That's where it becomes a challenge. And understanding that it's not just the author who's creating that content, it's how are you going to convey that to a user who may not understand it completely. Government forms, great example of that. To you, straightforward because you authored it. To an end user, I applied for a US visa recently. I have never seen such complicated paperwork in my life, and that's why I had a lawyer. But understanding how to navigate that, I can see it, I am university educated, and I still called my lawyer. If I couldn't see it and I couldn't understand the context of content, just because you wrote the document doesn't mean you understand how someone's going to navigate that document. So you've got to really understand and appreciate the end user in this. It's not about checklists, it's not about making sure your job's done, it's making sure that the end user is able to read that content, okay? Because we are tight on time and I just got my moment. In Ontario, if you employ more than 50 people, you must create every single piece of content, doesn't matter if it's public or internal at this point as of January 1st. If you do not create compliant content, the author of the document is liable to $100,000 per day per file, not on the organization, on the individual author. It is really, now, it hasn't been enforced because we're trying to use the carrot approach rather than the stick, but that's what we're working under, and it's a very tough piece of legislation. But I will say it's working. And now the federal government is basically about to implement the exact same law across the entire country. So we're seeing how this has worked, and the volume of accessible content is being generated daily. And it's compliant. But every day, I will get a call from someone new who was hired saying, your document's not accessible, which I obviously giggle at and say, okay, why? Well, we ran it through this checker. Do you know why it's failing there? No, but it fails, so I can't accept it. I said, but this is why it's failing, and this is why it's fully compliant because it passes this test. Well, we weren't told about that. We don't use that tool. We haven't decided how to evaluate what we're doing. And over the last 6 years, we've seen a lot of misinformation be spread. So just be sure you're understanding where you're starting from, where the bar is set, and what your potential exposure is if you're not generating that content. We always laugh at the lawsuits in the US over accessibility. Well, we kind of giggle saying, why is that worth $10 million? But apparently it is. And the net result is that people are implementing the accessible routes, which is great, but we're still seeing inaccessible approaches to content, and the person waves a flag saying, I passed a checker. Make sure you realize that someone has to read this. So please keep that in mind. And with that, I think that's my 30 minutes. So thank you.
For Adam, and I will be repeating your questions to make sure that the folks on live stream can hear them.
Yeah.
You talked about complex material being very difficult to do. Specifically, I guess math and tables are the biggies. Are there facilities within PDF that let you handle math and tables and do like reading orders and stuff?
Absolutely. Sorry.
The question is, are there facilities in PDF for handling math and tables?
So I will answer that in two ways. One with tables and one with math. Tables, yes. The other thing that I will extend to that, so you can, doesn't matter how complex the table is, you can make that accessible and compliant under PDF UA without any issue. It's sometimes cumbersome depending on the tools that you're using, but it is completely capable. And what I will say is there's been an underpinning of trying to oversimplify content to overcome limitations in tools. Don't. You cannot oversimplify a financial table. It's built that way for a reason, and trying to pull it apart and redesign it doesn't work. All of the capabilities exist within PDF. Math is a bit of a toughie. We have actually implemented MathML into PDF before. Right now, under PDF UA 1, I would consider it a bit of a workaround with the requirements for alt text and describing the formula. We're working on a new approach in PDF 2 and UA 2. We actually had a conversation about it the other day, and that's coming. The challenge becomes the authoring software and how it's coming into play. If we're not getting good structure initially, a lot of the figures are coming through as images rather than actual taggable math. So you've got to understand the relationship of that content. Again, we do a lot of it for students, and understanding how they're learning helps us generate a better PDF.
if you have math ML and math, can you insert them in PDF and get it read?
Yes, but it is not compliant. So it doesn't fall under the spec today. That's the problem. So you can tag it that way and it will read it that way, but the structure isn't navigable the same way. But when you're repurposing that content,
Follow-up question.
I'll be here all day. Yeah.
So I use common look as a checker
Mhm.
because I know that the Acrobat checker that you just mentioned is not accurate, right? For tables.
Those are your words, not mine. I didn't say that.
All right.
I may have implied it, but
We all know that the checker as of today is not accurate. What other tools besides, because the Adobe Common Look, like the Common Look plugin would pass with PDF UA, and then I would run the checker just for shits and giggles, and it would give me errors. And I know the standards, and I know those are like false positives, but some of the clients that you just mentioned, they say, oh, this is not compliant. Like recently a client asked me to put a span inside of a P tag for all bolded, italic, or color text. And I'm like, so,
Oh, no. Right.
So-
But, so, again, and she runs the checker, and she asked me this, so I'm trying to come up with another, I use Common Look, I use the report, I attach my PDF, related up to the PDF UA standard. So besides Common Look plugin, is there any other checker that
So-
gives you quality control?
So the question is, what checkers essentially are available to help you understand the degree of compliance with your PDF files?
I guess I don't want to overstep on the record in endorsing anything. If you see me afterwards, I'm happy to share that with you. What I will say is, in the same will hold true to screen readers. JAWS and NVDA and VoiceOver are all capable of reading a PDF, and all of the major PDF checking tools are capable of testing the PDF. But there are differences, and you have to understand what those differences are and what the impact of those differences are. So from a testing tool standpoint, we use certain tools that are publicly available, and we use certain tools that we only use privately. But we know where our gaps are, and we know what the difference is. So for example, there's a notorious fail in Acrobat for if you embed an LBL, if you nest an LBL tag. It's perfectly legal in the spec, but Acrobat calls it out every single time. If I can explain that to someone, and I know why it's failing, just because it's not included. It's not an accessibility issue, it's not a compliance issue, it fully complies with the spec, no problem, I can work through that. The challenge becomes when people put interns or summer students onto a project and say, test all these PDFs. This fails, this fails, this fails, this fails, only because they don't know what they're up against. So if you understand the context and the challenges with each of those checkers, then you're able to overcome it. And I will say about false positives, a lot of people will blame a false positive in a checker because they don't know what the actual error is or how to fix it. So there are many instances where we'll see a file come in saying, this file's perfect except that. Why is that the case? Well, you haven't tagged this correctly, or the structure isn't correct, or there are many factors to it. But it's because you just don't know the detail behind it, and you're basing everything off of that checker. That corner.
Hi. So, it sounds like maybe there isn't a final checklist, accessibility checklist by the U.S. government, maybe your government either. Like, this is the final standard. It has to fit this accessibility tool.
Yes.
It passes this single one, then you're good. It sounds like there's multiple tools.
Well, so we have.
So the question is, what is there a final or ultimate checklist or for PDF or application to test for PDF accessibility, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I will say this. In the U.S., it is a very mixed bag. Each jurisdiction does something different. You've had a department create their own accessibility standard, which is fascinating. I don't know why. Anyways, we have, what the Ontario provincial government has done is say, this is our testing tool, this is our standard, full stop. One of the challenges with our legislation is when it was written, PDF UA didn't exist. So there was some gray area because everything said it had to be WCAG 2 compliant. Well, you can't make a PDF WCAG 2 compliant. It's apples and oranges. So when there's a clause in our legislation that says content must comply with its most relevant standard. So I can't make Braille WCAG 2 compliant. It has to conform with UEB. PDF's now the same. It took about 3 years to convince our accessibility directorate to implement that. But once that was the case, it was well established, and that's what we go after. And there is no gray. And it has helped their teams, their writers, their authors just say, am I accessible or not? I'm not going to be an accessibility expert, so I don't care about the other stuff around it. Tell me what to do, I'll do it, and go from there. But yes, knowing that many of your departments are independent, I mean, you were mentioning about Google Docs earlier, which is not a widespread option through the federal government yet, and from an accessibility standpoint shouldn't be at all. But if you're able to standardize and leverage best practices from one team to the next, that's what we saw be very successful. And again, we've had this legislation now for 6 years. So it's been implemented over and over and over again, but we still have challenges with it because someone new comes in and says, well, I was trained how to do this by that person, I'm going to do it my way. So unless you codify it, you're always going to have those gray areas.
We have time for one or two other brief questions. Please, if possible, use the microphones. I'll bring this to you on this side, or use the one down there, as the folks online can't really hear your question, and I'm not doing a very good job of repeating them.
Here, Duff.
Hi, Adam. So you spoke about outsourced remediation services, and also you listed your, I guess, cons against maybe internal teams of training and remediation. So outsourced remediation services has a budgetary cost that's attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to a software product and a need, like if a commercial company or the federal government, which clearly shows that there are actually internal teams purchasing software and being trained, from a long-term financial or budgetary perspective, how do you compare the two?
So the question, go ahead and repeat it.
Sorry, Duff. The question is the sustainability question between internal teams remediating versus outsourcing remediation for ongoing content, and that relationship of cost benefit and its exposure. I will answer that in two ways. The first, I don't believe that one solution fits all. You can't outsource everything, and you can't, most government groups will not outsource everything, nor will they be able to internalize it. So when you talk about costs, putting a software license on every single user's desktop, especially when they're not going to use it, is also a waste of money. And we've seen that happen. We've seen that be implemented. There's nothing wrong with doing this. It's just, and that's why I will respond to your question by saying I'm not against internal remediation. Be aware of what your realities are internally. If you're a small team, you're not going to bring on a dedicated remediation provider. The other thing to keep in mind is, and we saw this happen with a few companies, they hired a bunch of people or trained a bunch of people and then weren't generating enough content on a regular basis to keep them busy. So you've got to understand, how much content are you really generating on a day-to-day basis? Can you justify that person's cost? Because internally, a salary is a cost. Time is a cost. You've got to respect that amount of time. If you're going to have everyone try and figure out why they can't get an annotation to comply, that costs money. That being said, maybe there's too much content and you're not going to be able to bring in enough people to deal with that. So understanding your document strategy really has to do with your own realities internally, where your budget allocations can be, what your time allocation is going to be, and how ultimately you're going to generate that compliant content on a daily basis.